I'm Ronan Levy, co-founder and executive chairman of Field Trip Health Limited, a leading psychedelics company. In this episode of Ever Forward Radio, we dive pretty deep into the conversations around the science and medical applications of psychedelics and what it means for the future of medicine, mental health, and society broadly speaking.
3, 2, 1.
All right, Ronan, I'm so glad to have you here on the show today and so glad to just be in the presence of somebody that is doing such phenomenal, new, pioneering, tip of the spear, in my opinion, work in the world of emotional health, mental health, all forms of health and wellness. So thank you and welcome.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for the kind words. It does mean a lot every time people express the gratitude for the work we're doing. It helps because I'd be doing this anyway, but to know that it's actually reaching people and impacting people, it keeps the motivation going.
Well, Ronan, I guess my first question is, what is going on in the world of psychedelics right here, right now, in the world? Here, August 2021. I don't know, it's my personal awareness theory, but just they seem so top of mind and so prevalent. Is it cool? Is it trendy? Or are we finally just having this awakening to healing potential?
I think it's both, to be quite honest. It is certainly cool and trendy these days. I mean, psychedelics have become a very hot conversation, particularly the psychedelic renaissance. And we are in a renaissance. There's no doubt about it pertaining to psychedelics. Scientifically, medically, culturally, there's so much happening. But at the same time, I kind of fall prey to that personal awareness problem. Recently, it's not a problem, but it struck me that being so encapsulated in the psychedelic industry and the psychedelic movement, everything that's happening here, I kind of think everyone's paying as much attention to psychedelics as I am. And then, I realized a friend of ours, this guy Robbie Bent, who's been a great advocate for Field Trip. And
He was recently on the
Rob.
show. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So like in a conversation with Robbie, indirectly, I wasn't participating. Like Robbie kind of said, like, yeah, most of my friends are not comfortable doing psychedelics. Most of my friends aren't comfortable with ketamine, and we're just like, wait, what? Robbie Bent's friends aren't comfortable doing this stuff? Okay, like the world isn't quite as I thought it appeared to be, but we are definitely, I would say, the tip of the spear of what I think is going to be actually the most significant cultural influence, possibly in history. I know those are big terms, and I don't like to exaggerate. I try to be pretty grounded and measured in what I say and how I communicate it. But I really do think like this is a turning point, right? Like this is a massive change in the global zeitgeist. I think it reflects a change in how we think about medicine. I think it reflects a change of how we think about emotions. I think it reflects a change in how we think about spirituality. And the waterfall effects of all that kind of stuff, we kind of got a taste for it in the counterculture in the 60s. I did a podcast with Dr. Julie Holland, and she had this great line. She's like, the hippies were right. They were right about so many things like, feminism, environmentalism, consciousness, like all those kind of things that are now becoming mainstream and cool and accepted. It's like they were talking about that in the 60s, and that was inspired a lot by psychedelics. And now the counterculture was in some respects very small and very limited in the number of people involved, but the cultural impact, we're still feeling it today. Now take an environment that's much more receptive to what all the hippies were talking about in the 60s and bring all of that impact, but with way more people, with the power of the internet. God, it's like you start to do the math and the waterfall effects, and it's like, yeah, this is going to be truly game changing in the kind of level of game changing as like the internet has created, or and talking about like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and trying to put people on Mars. It's like that's the level of impact I think we're potentially talking about right now.
Well, Ronan, talk is one thing, and I definitely want to get into the personal experience, the qualitative data, and the personal transformational experiences that I have had through the use of psychedelics, and I'm sure you as well. But to the novice, the new person, which I would even still say that I am, what is the science showing behind it? Why are we even considering psychedelics as therapy, as treatment, as medicine now?
Yeah, I think it's important to clarify that we're not thinking about it that way now. They were actually thinking about it that way in the 50s and 60s, and then there's this kind of like political upheaval that led to the termination of research. But LSD was one of the most studied from an academic perspective, molecules out there in the 50s and 60s. There were thousands of papers written on LSD from the perspective of its medical and therapeutic applications. So what we're talking about now is not actually new. It really is a renaissance. It's a rebirth of it. But what triggered it and why there seems to be so much excitement is, I guess, two things. One is there's the massive unmet need consideration, right? And I think we all recognize there's a global mental health crisis happening. There already was, and then you layer on all the impacts of COVID, and we've got an even more significant thing. And I think people are starting to understand that the impact of this mental health crisis isn't just like, oh, that sucks. There's significant humanitarian implications. There's significant economic implications. Like people forget that depression and anxiety disorders are going to become the leading global burden of disease, which means they cost the global economy more than any other disease out there, primarily from lost productivity, right? From people not being able to get up and go to work or not being productive in work because they're suffering with depression and anxiety. So,
And
why
it's
are we
already being
having
shown
this
during the
moment?
times of COVID this is the second biggest comorbidity for people that are getting COVID-19 and all these other variants, hospitalized and deaths. It's depression, fear, and anxiety, all these secondary, tertiary comorbidities.
Oh, I hadn't seen that. That's
Yeah,
interesting. Yeah,
yeah.
that's totally on point as well. So, what's happening right now is because there's this massive need, and we're just becoming aware of how important this conversation is. And then there's the science, and the science is mind blowing, and I say that pretty consciously because it really is. I think what we're seeing now, there were a couple of impetus for it, impetuses. I don't know what the right word is. Um,
Empathitai.
there you go. Um, Two things. One is like Rick Doblin and MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. Rick is a great guy. I've had the pleasure of getting to know him. But one of the things that has always really amazed me about Rick is he's been doing this since 1986. He's been trying to drive clinical studies for MDMA, which is the active ingredient in street drug ecstasy, for to kind of ground it in a conversation that people may be more familiar with. Since 1986, it's been almost 40 years of him trying to push a boulder up the hill, and he's started to make real progress. So what happened is about 20 years ago, ketamine, which is an FDA globally approved drug as an anesthetic, even though it definitely got a reputation as a party drug and all that kind of stuff, it is an approved drug. It's a legal drug. It's a legal drug, not the illegal drug. That is actually used quite frequently, to the point where the World Health Organization indicated that it's one of the essential drugs worldwide because it is an incredibly safe anesthetic when
Wow.
used as an anesthetic.
Wow. Wow.
Such that if you have children and your child breaks a bone and you take them to the ER, instead of giving other form of anesthetic, often doctors will give ketamine because it's so safe, because it doesn't depress the central nervous system. There's no risk of overdose really with ketamine. And so it's been a drug that's been part of modern Western medicine for 60 or 50 or 60 years, right? So it's been an essential part of our medical system. Got a bad reputation because of party drugs. But what happened about 20 years ago is that doctors noticed that when they used ketamine as an anesthetic, there was a corresponding, use the term comorbidity. I don't know what the proper term is here, but there was a corresponding improvement in a person's mental health. That people who had received ketamine as an anesthetic also indicated that their mental health improved significantly. And so that spawned a whole bunch of research into ketamine as a mental health treatment. And the research was so profound and so effective that even Dr. Tom Insel, who used to be the director of the National Institute of Mental Health in the US, declared that ketamine is the most important breakthrough in depression treatment in the last 50 years. Something like that. I'm
Can
paraphrasing, but like,
pause right there for me, please, because I really want the listener to pick up on that.
yeah.
Ketamine was discovered having a secondary bonus effect, positive, not a negative side effect like a lot of other medications, like a lot of other things in general, for mental health. Its first noticeable positive side effect, and side effect in general, was to the benefit of mental health.
That's correct. Yeah.
That,
And that got seen enough that it triggered a focus of research being could this be used as a depression treatment or other mental health treatment. And the success of that research, I think, was one of the big drivers of this psychedelic renaissance. It wasn't the only thing the work Rick and Maps was doing and pushing along those studies as well was helping. And then about 10 years ago or so, um, it actually, I didn't realize this, but someone educated me on this, that a lot of research on psilocybin actually continued. So psilocybin being magic mushrooms was continuing in Europe, but because we have such a US centric worldview over here in North America, we obviously don't talk about that. But um, somewhere about 10 or 15 years ago, work at Imperial College in London, as well as Johns Hopkins, led to an approval for using psilocybin in an academic clinical trial for treatment of depression. And so this research with ketamine, this work with MDMA, and then with psilocybin, and the profound results all of them showed has really led to this moment. And what are the results that we're talking about? With ketamine and ketamine assisted therapy, and I think it's really important, actually, I'll stop at this point to make it clear about what we're talking about. We talk about psychedelics, and that's kind of a lazy term of art. The truth is, all of the research that we're seeing is about psychedelic assisted therapy, not psychedelics. It's not treating psychedelics like an antidepressant of like, here's your drug, here's your pill, take it, you'll feel better. This is a very different form of medicine. It's experiential medicine or contextual medicine, where it's like active work. It's kind of like, I'm trying to draw a parallel, even though this is a terrible analogy. It's like if you suffered a physical injury and are doing physio, then like taking steroids to build those muscles back is going to accelerate, that recovery. And in the same kind of way, that's what psychedelics do. Psychedelics open people up to do healing, but the healing really comes from pairing that with therapy, right? So it's psychedelic assisted therapy that's really generating all of this profoundly positive research. And so what are we seeing? We're seeing with ketamine and ketamine assisted therapy, after a few sessions with it, people can have substantially reduced depression symptoms from severe to mild to non-existent, and certainly that's what we're seeing in our field trip health centers that are opening up across North America. And those benefits can last for weeks or months at a time. So instead of taking a day-to-day SSRI or antidepressant, which people typically report, kind of dulls their perception, it causes weight gain, loss of libido, lots of negative side effects. Instead of having to do that day to day, after a few sessions with ketamine, which tend to be profoundly positive and enjoyable, people can be depression free for weeks or months at a time. So that's the kind of research we're seeing with ketamine. With MDMA, which is actually where the research is probably the most advanced, MAPS in its first phase of its phase three, or the first part of its phase three clinical trial, looking at MDMA assisted therapy for the treatment of PTSD, found that 70%, 70% of participants in the trial no longer qualified as having PTSD following 3 MDMA assisted therapy sessions according to the DSM criteria for PTSD. And those benefits were sustained for 6 months at a minimum. So we're talking about a near effective cure for PTSD. Not totally, it didn't work for everybody. And we don't know that, in a year or 2 years, these people who no longer qualified as being PTSD patients didn't regress into suffering those symptoms again. But for 6 months out, they no longer had PTSD, right? So these are amazing results, especially when you compare to the standard of care for treatment of PTSD using antidepressants primarily, was seeking a 30% improvement in symptoms versus a 70% cure rate. This is orders of magnitude more effective. And these trials had no significant adverse events, right? So these people went through these experiences, they were profoundly positive experiences, and there were no negative side effects, no serious negative side effects associated with this. So you have this profoundly effective medication with very little to no downside. It's really amazing. With psilocybin, which is the other psychedelic that has been studied in earnest. Now trials are happening with LSD and DMT and other psychedelics as well, but psilocybin is the other one that's been studied, at least in the modern context, very heavily. We've seen clinical trials where the antidepressant effects of a single psilocybin-assisted therapy session can last for up to 5 years. 5 years, one session. So again, game-changing efficacy in terms of treating mental health, and you talked about this in the conversation of healing, and this is very much what's happening. There's no doubt about that. But the other thing that people aren't talking about right now, because it seems almost too good to be true, and anytime you hear something along these lines, it typically does seem to be too good to be true. But so far, this seems to be bearing out with psychedelics, is that beyond just the mental health improvements, although I would argue it's probably correlated to the mental health improvements, is that in addition to these significant improvements in the PHQ-9 scores and the GAD-7 scores and all of the other metrics of mental health, people report increased creativity. People report increased empathy. People report increased openness to other people's perspective and viewpoints, something that truthfully is sorely lacking in this world. People report increased regard for the planet. So not only is their mental health significantly improved, the side effects of psychedelic therapies are actually really pro-social. People are basically nicer, more thoughtful, have greater concern for the environment and people around them. So you're talking about a one-two punch in terms of like these are magic pills, and I hate to say it, but it does seem in so many respects like the potential of these is just extraordinary.
Thank you so much for the breakdown on those kind of three main psychedelics that are being looked at and studied and used. And I really do love how you started off by saying assisted therapy, ketamine assisted therapy, psychedelic assisted therapy. What I love most about that is, the holistic person in me, and what I used to strive for in my coaching practice was there are a lot of things that we can use to help us get better, to get well, to treat an illness or disease, an injury, and even maintain wellness, or even, prevent, ideally, certain things from happening. But when it is coupled with support, when it is coupled with, hey, here's a thing, and then here's the mental component that goes with it, here's assistance in navigating these new waters that you are about to set sail on, that I think is one of the most profound aspects here that I hope the listener is picking up on. What is so unique, and dare I even say necessary, in that experience that someone is not going to maybe not get in just using it on their own, or just going into another type of clinic that doesn't have this assisted therapy coupled with it?
Yeah. So if we talk about why psychedelic assisted therapies seem so effective, it's probably the best way to start to think about this. So it seems, and no one has the perfect answer, but it seems that there are three things happening when we talk about psychedelic assisted therapies. And this is true about ketamine, this is true about MDMA, this is true about psilocybin, it's true about LSD, it's probably true about DMT. These three things happen. First of all, there's serotonin, they hit the serotonin receptors. I never say that word right. Serotonin, I'm not going to try. They hit the they basically cause a flood of serotonin, right? Which is immediately and very quickly causes a short-term boost in mood. So people have a very positive experience and feel better within about half an hour or 45 minutes. And I'm going to make a note to figure out how to pronounce the word properly before my next interview.
I'm sure we'll have someone in
So
the
that
internet will let us know that for sure.
Yeah. Serotonin. Anyway, um, so you have this just an immediate lift. You feel better almost immediately within like half an hour. Most people report a significant improvement in mood. Secondly, during a psychedelic experience, because when we talk about psychedelic assisted therapy, the way it's done, at least in a clinical setting, is people are given eye shades, have headphones put on, and they're invited to go inward, right? It's not like walking through the forest or having a party. You shut your eyes and you really let the experience come up. And people talk about setting an intention for their experience and trying to guide what they want to get out of it. The truth is, your mind and the drug takes you where it needs to go by and large, and what comes up regardless of your intention. But by going inwards, what often people often experience is they revisit past experiences, past traumas, past events, and it can start the emotional processing around those events. So, in many ways, this aspect of it is just kind of like what people try to achieve through conventional therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy. But it takes years to kind of like break down those defenses and really start to open up about what happens. With psychedelics, people go from potentially never having done any therapy to doing the emotional processing that you get after 10 years of therapy, but in a single session, right? So you start this work, the really therapeutic aspect of just processing your emotions. And then the third thing that happens, and this is where the therapy I think becomes most important, is there's evidence that psilocybin and ketamine and presumably MDMA and all the other classic psychedelics actually cause new neural synapses to grow. So basically, the parts of your brain that talk like that enable cells, the brain cells to talk to each other, you start growing new neural synapses. And during this period, which is generally believed to be a period of neuroplasticity, people are much more able to make real, meaningful, functional changes in their outlooks, in their habits, in their worldview, in their lifestyle. And that's where you get the sustained benefit, right? So if you think about, people talk about how children have far greater neuroplasticity than adults, and that's why they're so quick to develop new skills. That's why they're so adept at learning new languages, is because their brain is much more flexible. It's much more fluid and can to adapt to new circumstances. As we age, the kind of mental models and our ego becomes more rigid, and so learning new skills becomes more challenging. Um, Following a psychedelic experience, your brain is much more childlike in terms of its neuroplasticity, and so if you start deciding that you're going to meditate every day, or go to the gym every day, or wake up and have gratitude, adopting that as a new practice becomes much more entrenched. And so everything that you try and do through some cognitive behavioral therapy techniques like motivational interviewing or behavioral activation, it sticks, right? It's not just like throwing a ball against a wall. That ball actually, it's like you throw the spaghetti noodle and it stays. And so
Yeah, it's not
not
just a
only have you
temporary
done the
state of
emotion.
change state. It's a change state that allows malleability and new learning and immediate application, at least in my experience.
That's exactly right. And so you've got this emotional processing, and then you've got this changed lifestyle, right? So you've done a lot of the emotional work, and then you've basically built skills and habits and knowledge and all this kind of stuff that enables you to live a happier life. We know that, and this is what got me interested in psychedelics in the first place. But we know going to the gym and exercising makes you stronger and healthier and helps you live longer and makes you happier, right? We all know that. Not everybody goes to the gym, but no one really debates that going to the gym is good for you. We don't think about mental health that way. We don't think about our emotional health that way. We're always super reactive when it comes to that kind of stuff. But if we became proactive about this and started adopting those habits and doing the work and all that kind of stuff with which psychedelics, you know, um, greatly accelerate, just kind of like drinking protein drinks after a workout will really accelerate your muscle gain. Through psychedelics, if you can start doing these things and adopting them and making your lifestyle one that supports great outlook, great mental health, great happiness, it's going to stick, and it's going to last. And so I think that's why we see these amazing results.
I want to take a moment and kind of just share with you and my audience. My very first experience using a psychedelic was with MDMA. And in total honesty here for my audience, that experience still is with me. So when you talk about the longevity of behavior change and neurogenesis and just your mindset, having long lasting ripple effects into how you behave and how you show up in the world. My very first experience was, long story short, walked into a situation last year, and someone that I knew, trusted very closely, offered me some. And up until that point, Ronan, I only recently started using cannabis, like just a couple of years ago. Growing up with certain belief systems in my household and religion, and I was in the military, and so all these other things were very taboo and off limits for me. And something that if I ever did, I would immediately become a homeless loser and amount to nothing in my life and burn in hell. My personal experience. And so when this person offered me MDMA, I looked at this person, I looked around me, and I was surrounded by people that I trust, I respected. Actually, quite a few of them were doctors and medical care providers. And so I thought, well, if any of my worst case scenarios do come true, this is a place to have it happen with, doctors and all these other things. And that evening, I had one of the most profound realizations of getting out of my own way. The ego work. It showed me my ego in a way that was a place of friction with me and my wife, was this kind of on again, off again argument, friction area that I saw for the first time ever on her side. I could completely get away from my attachment to this topic. And I later shared with her, and I just completely broke down. I started crying. I realized, I said, I'm so sorry. I am so sorry for my inability to not see it from your side. And I talked it through, and I said, I see this, I see point A, B, and C. And we have not ever had to bring that conversation up ever again. It wasn't anything major, it wasn't anything wild and crazy, but it was just something that was recurring. And the problem was me. And that experience allowed me to completely get out of my own head and to see this other thing. And where it came from, I don't know. It just happened the way that it did. And that was my very first ever experience. And that was with MDMA. And to this day, like I said, the profound effect is still with us here. So it not only got me out of that change state right then and there, but long lasting behavior change to my relationship health, to my mental health, and how I interact with certain people.
Yeah, that's a
Is,
beautiful
is that fairly
experience.
common, certain experiences like that in your experience?
Yeah, that's definitely one. I know my first ever experience with psilocybin. It gave me a sense of empathy. Like myself and my business partners were in not a serious dispute, but in a prickly situation with our former employer, um, and like we had felt like we had taken the high road, and we had taken the high road. Like if I go back and look at it, it's like we did the mature thing. But I got this deep sense of like, oh, I understand why they're pissed off. It's like I wouldn't have done anything different, but I could understand the emotional rationale why they felt like they had been, mistreated, and I got it. And so like that's MDMA is known as being an empathogen. That's exactly what you're talking about. It gave you a new sense of empathy. It enabled you to put yourself in your wife's shoes and be like, oh, I get it now. And what a powerful realization. And then, what two thoughts that kind of flow from that. The other experience that people have very often with MDMA, but all psychedelics, and we start to get into like the more spiritual kind of things. And I know that like turns a lot of people off, but where the conversation is going to end up. I think it has to end up there. But people are able to feel like love for the first time. Like
Yes, yes,
feel
yes.
like the person I work with, Erwin Perlman, he talks about things like beauty being a transformative energy, like not aesthetic beauty. It can be aesthetic beauty, but like when you have that moment of beauty, right? Like when you experience, I don't know, a waterfall or like a magical moment between mother and child or whatever it is. It's like that changes you. The world is fundamentally different after you've had that experience than it was before. And so, particularly for people who have trauma, it's like they have problems feeling love, right? They have trauma. I think most people do. Certainly, I did. Like I couldn't receive love. I couldn't actually feel it. It's like my this was not psychedelic. This was perfectly independent of psychedelics, but it was a very psychedelic moment. Was like when I was 30, about 34, I realized I had this instance where I had called a friend of mine, a good friend of mine who lives in Silicon Valley, and he hadn't called me back in about 2 days. And I found myself doing the mental game I had always done in circumstances where I decided that I had done something wrong. He didn't want to be friends with me, and I started planning my life without my friend in my life. And for the first time, I caught myself and I said, oh, how fucked up is that? That I've always made the assumption that if someone doesn't call me back in what I deem to be a normal time frame, they've decided they don't like me and are moving on. It's like it showed me how much I saw myself as unlovable, right? Like, and I
Really,
couldn't,
wow.
how could you possibly have like a real friendship or a real relationship if you assumed everybody is going to abandon you at some point? It's not true. My friends weren't going to abandon me. This particular friend would never abandon me. Like, we have such a deep bond, but I couldn't let that in. And so, for a lot of people, when they have a psychedelic experience, like I was able to get there because I'd done like 10 years of work with Irwin and all that kind of stuff. And it finally had that click moment. But with psychedelics, people can go from having that their entire life and just being like, oh, no, I am worthy of love. Oh, my friends actually do love me. I just couldn't let that in to me, right? And so that's the other experience, particularly on MDMA, that people have is like they feel love for the first time in a much more visceral way than being like, oh yeah, my wife loves me. It's like, oh, she really does love me, and I know what that feels like now. And then, anytime things get hairy or challenging, it's like, um, you'd be like, "Oh, no, no, like, there's still love here, right? Like, we're having a fight, we're having an argument." But, for me, having a fight became existential, right? Because it's like, "Oh, we're disagreeing, this is gonna be the end of the relationship because love couldn't exist in my format." And it sounds like in some ways that may have been something that resonated with you. But, like, that's what happens on psychedelics. These are the experiences that people have on psychedelics.
And it's funny you bring up love because any psychedelic experience I have had, at the end of the day, the end of the night, whatever the situation is, the set and setting is, ultimately, whatever work I go through, whatever my intention was, ultimately it always comes back to love. And for me, I want to bring up love in psilocybin. So when I first tried psilocybin, that was kind of like the unexplicable experience, sensation that I didn't know I was experiencing at the time. But looking back, I was like, oh my God, I was in pure, undeniable state of being, thought, love. And I, again, and I think there's something to be said here too, that set and setting are very, very important. I was, again, in an environment with some of my favorite people in the world, some of the people that mean the most to me, very, very close relationships, friendships, acquaintances. And I remember finally looking back and just like looking at everybody, looking at the room, and just being in such awe of the state of love that I was in, for being grateful that I was there, being grateful that these people were in my life, and then just the years and the Rolodex of things, places, events that we had done together. And just, it was an emphatic just state of love. And I've been in love. I am in love. I love people. I love my wife. I love my dog. I love cold brew. But when you can experience from your head to your toe this state, I'm just sharing my personal experience of that psychedelic state of love. It is one of the most visceral sensations I have ever had in my entire life. Um, so that's kind of more like the you were talking earlier, the woo. There's the qualitative aspect that I think a lot of people have when they go on psychedelics or use them. But I want to shift gears, if we could, to what really blew my mind the most when it came to psilocybin. Back in July, I went on a 30-day microdose protocol of 2 days on, 1 day off. And I know I have all the ingredients. I know exactly everything that was in there. And I'm a person, and my audience knows, I'm aware of a lot of things. I track a lot of things. I have Apple Watch, Whoop. I, have tracked my Fitness Pal for, a decade. I'm very, very curious as to what is going on in the world and what is going on in my body and what makes me tick and how I can improve it. Ronan, when I tell you nothing, I'm 35 years old, nothing, 35 years old and 15 years of my wellness journey here, nothing in my life has had anything close to the profound effect in mind and body and long lasting effects as that 30-day psilocybin protocol. And what blew my mind the most was I tracked it. My every single biomarker on my Whoop device, HRV, respiratory rate, resting heart rate, recovery, sleep, every biomarker that we want to see improve, not only did almost immediately, but the benefits have stayed. My HRV increased 40% in that 30
Wow.
days. And my now lowest HRV, heart rate variability score, is what I used to dream of getting as a high. I am getting in the 80s, 90s. That's my new lows. Now I'm getting 120s, 140s, 150s. That 30-day protocol, I've been off now for about 5 weeks, almost 6 weeks. The changes were so long lasting, so profound that I couldn't refuse the data. I knew how I was feeling, but when I looked at those numbers, it just blew my mind. Is that a common trait when we're looking at things such as psilocybin?
Um, it's hard to say. So, especially with microdosing, there's not a lot of evidence for microdosing right now. In fact, the evidence that does exist suggests that it's actually no better than placebo. Now, that's a very limited evidence, and so I wouldn't accept it as microdosing doesn't work. I don't think that's true at all. You can't hear as many stories as I hear about people having profound positive outcomes on microdosing. But the evidence isn't, there's just not that body of evidence to support microdosing as much as there is for the macrodosing with therapy approach. But just as an N of two, I recently did a very intense psychedelic session with a therapist with MDMA psilocybin and 4 ACO. And I've noticed that my HRV has basically doubled, since then, like tracking way higher
Yeah, my
since that
highs used to be
experience. But
like maybe like 60, 62, and like I said, now I'm getting in the 120s, 140s, and beyond.
yeah, yeah, for sure. So I mean, that's exactly what I'm saying. My HRV is not as good as you. I guess I'm more stressed than you, but it's probably true about trying to do a startup and having kids and all of that kind of stuff and COVID. But in any event, I'm curious, like, what was your protocol with microdosing? Because you've actually inspired me to give it another shot. I've dabbled with it a few times and then stopped and dabbled with it, but it sounds like a committed 30 days is a worthwhile experiment.
Oh, I highly recommend it. I'll walk you through it. And for the listener, I'll link this down in the show notes. I did a whole solo episode about this, and I walked through my personal experience. I walked through the numbers. I shared my Whoop data and everything. So this protocol was a 2 day on, 1 day off protocol. And
Yeah.
this blend, I guess you could call it, was the psilocybin strain, 0.165 milligrams. And then it had lion's mane, cordyceps, a little bit of niacin, long lac, vitamin B complex. I have all the ingredients. And so I did 2 days on, 1 day off.
Okay.
And me, anytime I would try introducing something new to my diet or a new supplement, I applied that same protocol to this microdose protocol, meaning I would try it on an empty stomach. I would try it first thing in the morning. I would try it in the afternoon. I would try it with a meal, after a meal. I would try it with caffeine, with coffee, without caffeine, without coffee. Went through that for about the first week. And I found that no matter when I took it, if I took it with something or not, it really didn't make a difference in terms of its effectiveness. I felt great all the time, no matter when I took it. I had no problems with, sometimes a supplement on empty stomach can upset your stomach a little
Yeah.
bit. I had
Yeah.
nothing. So it didn't matter when I took it, how I took it, with whatever, the same effect happened and it was a good effect. So then after that, I really started paying attention and I found, Ronan, I was lit up in the most positive way, not tripping, not out of my mind. I had never been more present in my mind and my body on that protocol when my magic kind of formula was I would do a cortado, an iced cortado, so a double shot of espresso, a little bit of almond milk, a little bit of honey, and some MCT oil powder. That with my microdose, I was invincible. I was so on, and I talk about this in the solo episode, I could upshift and downshift in my consciousness and my productivity, what I wanted to do. If I wanted to just floor it for the next 2 hours and just work my ass off and just be so focused and so diligent, I could. If I wanted to downshift and just chill and be present and allow the medicine to do its thing and bring up thoughts and emotions and work on that, I could. And I could come in and out just as easily. As it was so conscious for me what I wanted to have happen that I
Yeah.
could. It was
Super cool.
amazing.
Yeah, yeah, it's cool. I mean, that's amazing. And like the truth is like I've recently become vocal, at least on social media, about the idea that like the placebo effect is the wrong articulation of what's happening, right? It's like, isn't the placebo effect actually something that's really magical?
Yeah,
It actually
yeah.
shows us that if you think hard enough about something, you can actually change your biology, right? Like it
It's a
shows that
thing.
your mind can heal your body. It's so I like to call it the actualization effect because you're actualizing the outcome you want with your brain. And it's something that we should be encouraging. I get why it needs to be measured in the context of medicine. But so often people are like,
Yeah.
oh, I perform no better than placebo. It's like, who cares, right? Like if
If the same
placebo
effect
works
is
for
happening,
60% of
like,
people, it's
hello?
amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's like sometimes people get caught up in science for the sake of science and forget that the purpose of science, listen, there's no reason not to do academic inquiry for the sake of academic inquiry. I get that. But like when it comes to like medical sciences, the only point of that is to enable people to live longer, happier, healthier lives, right? If you're not doing it for that reason, then what's the point of it, right?
Yeah.
And so yeah, if you see placebo and it works really well, cool. As my son likes to say, if you see a duck, duck. Um, but but it's just like it's really powerful, and we shouldn't be afraid of it. But so often, it's just like, oh, it's just the placebo effect. Don't look at it that way, being like, yeah, it's the
Yeah.
placebo effect, and that's a great way to heal too.
Yeah. Did you heal? Did you reach the marker for success you were after? Yes. Okay, great.
Yeah,
That's ultimately what I'm after as well. Um, Ronan, kind of beginning to get towards the end here. I just want to say again, thank you so much for your time and expertise and being so open about all of this. I know it's your work, but it's also your passion, and it very quickly is becoming passion of mine. Um, where do you think us as the general public, the consumer, the user of psychedelics, where do you think we should really be more cautious? Do we need to be treading lightly with anything? Is there anything to worry about, or where? I guess what I'm also really asking is, are we just latching onto another trend? Is this just going to become the popular thing to do, and people are maybe losing sight of the purpose and just not using it properly or not respecting the process?
I mean, I think that's inevitably always a concern. We before getting into the psychedelics industry, I was in the medical cannabis industry in Canada, and like watching what happened with CBD. I remember I knew the CBD had sort of jumped the shark. Not to say that there aren't really incredible potential therapeutic benefits of CBD, but in terms of the way it evolved, I saw a clothing line with clothing infused with CBD, and I'm like, oh my god, this has gone way too
That
far.
is, yeah, that's way too far. I'm a CBD advocate and user, but you're not going to see me promoting a CBD infused clothing line. That's for damn
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, it's just ridiculous. But there's that potential risk here as well, which is people are going to see psychedelics as a panacea, and I really do think there's a lot of reason to be very optimistic about the potential impact of psychedelics, both in terms of the treatment of mental health applications, but also in terms of really helping to open up meaningful conversations around some of the more vexing societal challenges that we face. Um, in many respects, I think they're pretty tightly aligned, right? Like if we look at the polarization in U.S. politics, it's like there's a lot of trauma on both sides of it, right? Like, I did a podcast with a woman named Duran Young, who's the founder of Black Therapist Rocks, as well as Director X, and both of them, people of color, recognize that like racists typically have their own trauma that causes them to be racist, right? Like bullies are often the result of bullying in some
Yeah, yeah,
ways, and
exactly. Usually.
um, so if we start to address like I just raised that from the perspective of like all of this healing and helping people process and all that kind of stuff, and start to address some of those more vexing issues. That being said, with all drugs there's risks, right? And so with psychedelics, there's different categories of risk. Some psychedelics are definitely, they create more biological risks, like 5-MeO DMT. Like the intensity of that experience has actually caused some deaths. You can overdose. It's very rare, but it does happen. So, that's not a risk I think most people need to worry about. With ketamine, if you're doing it episodic, like we do in our clinics, ketamine assisted therapy, there's no risk of addiction. But if you're taking ketamine every day, there's a slight risk of addiction. So that's something that people need to think about. But I think the biggest risks that people should keep in mind, again, they're very easy to manage, is that these are powerful psychotropic drugs, right? You and I have talked about really positive experiences, but they can also bring up very challenging traumas or past experiences that are nightmares. And in a controlled environment with a therapist who knows how to manage that, those really challenging experiences can actually be the most cathartic, and people can have the biggest breakthroughs. But if you're unsupported, if you're doing it on your own, or you're with people who don't know how to support that, then that traumatic experience, that challenging psychedelic experience, can create its own instance of trauma, right? And there is such a thing as a bad trip. you know the general conversation is that there's no such thing as a bad trip per se. There's only easy trips and challenging trips. Challenging trips can become bad trips, but it's not, you don't go from a trip to bad trip instantaneously. It's what happens around that, and if you have the right support, then a challenging trip can be really quite a positive experience. So that's one of the biggest risks. The other risk is that even though what we learned in high school was overblown and exaggerated, there are definitely instances of people getting high on psychedelics and doing stupid things like jumping off buildings. Yeah, not common.
Like feeling a sense
Does
of
happen.
invincibility and kind of things like that.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's a risk that has to be managed. Again, if we look at this from a therapeutic application, and I really think that the future, at least for the next 5 or 10 years, is like the legal access is going to be in controlled environments. Like if you look at what's happening in the state of Oregon, where they're legalizing psilocybin, they're actually legalizing psilocybin services. So it's not like you're going to a dispensary or drugstore and buying your mushrooms. you're going to an environment where there's a therapist who's going to oversee the experience and provide the mushrooms. So you have that safety of the container. So you're not going to have the instance of someone jumping off a building, and you're going to be in a place where if you do have a challenging experience, there's someone who's going to be qualified to help support that to make sure it doesn't become a bad trip. So those risks are really manageable, but they are risks that do exist out there, and I think people need to keep them in mind.
Thank you for kind of shining a light on that as well. I mean, anybody can become dependent on, addicted to anything that could be deemed in most people's eyes as a positive thing. I mean, there is such a thing as orthorexia. It's the unhealthy obsession with always trying to do the right thing, the healthy thing, eat the healthiest, cleanest, best foods, work out all the time. Anything can become a crutch, even if it is, on the surface level, air quote here, good or bad, positive or negative. So that's such a great point. And I was able to look up and confirm the psilocybin in my microdose is 165 milligrams, not
Okay.
0.165.
Yeah. Okay.
There
Yeah.
we go.
That
A little bit
seems
better.
much more.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Just going back to your comment. Generally speaking, at least with the tryptamines like psilocybin, MDMA, or sorry, psilocybin, LSD, DMT, um, molecules of that nature are actually non-addictive and in fact anti-addictive. So you can't develop a physical dependency. You can potentially develop an emotional dependency, but a physical dependency to tryptamines is almost impossible.
That's
Um,
mind blowing.
yeah, and they were actually some of the earliest studies was looking at psilocybin to help people get off other addictions like smoking or alcohol. In fact, Alcoholics Anonymous was inspired by the founders' LSD experience.
No shit.
So, yeah, yeah. So, like when you talk
Wow.
about like addiction and psychedelics, it's actually there's a lot of reasons to think that psychedelics. Sorry, I don't know if you
Oh,
heard
you're
me
good. You're
in the
good.
background. But psychedelics can actually be profoundly positive in helping people get over addictions because often addiction is the result of trauma. You tend to heal the trauma. You tend to be able to heal the circumstances that create the addictive behaviors. The other thing that's also important to note is, again, at least with the tryptamines, it's virtually impossible to overdose. There's like at least a case study. Now it's a case study of one where a woman took, I think, 10,000 micrograms of LSD, which is about 40 times a
Whoa.
typical
You said
dose.
40, 40 times?
40, yeah.
Wow.
She was sick for a couple of days, but no lingering effects. And in fact, she reports that her bipolar disorder disappeared after that. So with
Wow.
psilocybin
Wow.
and at least the tryptamines, you can't really overdose. You have a really bad experience and a really crappy couple of days, but at least from that perspective, it's not like heroin. It's not like opioids where there's real risk of that. Like like I said, they're pretty safe overall. Psychedelics, and in fact, there's a study conducted by Professor David Nutt, who used to be the chair of the UK's I forget exactly the title, but basically Council on the Misuse of Drugs. So he was basically the drug czar for the UK. And he conducted a study saying, let's not let politics run our drug policies. Let science run our drug policy. And his study found that and he looked at about 30 or 40 drugs, some of them illicit, legal drugs, some of them illegal, and looked at the relative harm profiles of them. And number one was alcohol in terms of its damage to society and damage to self. Alcohol was the most destructive drug. Heroin and opioids are all up there. At the very bottom of the list was psilocybin. Just above that was LSD. Two above that was MDMA, and like one above that was ketamine. All of which were below cannabis, and most people generally regard cannabis as safe. Um, again, it's not perfectly safe, but it's generally speaking pretty safe for all the drugs that are out there. And also, and the classic psychedelics were all below cannabis in their relative risk profiles. So we are talking about things that's safe. So it's important to like mention that there are risks, and you shouldn't go in blindly. Let's think these are panacea and everything's going to be great, but there's also a good reason to like not go in hyper nervous and anxious that you're going to do something to ruin your life because the likelihood of that is actually pretty low.
Um, Ronan, kind of getting towards the end here, man. I just want to again say thank you. And just the work you are doing and what Field Trip is doing in terms of educating and empowering the public in a way I have not seen in a long, long time. Again, it might be a little bit of awareness theory here of my own self because this is where I am in my wellness and healing journey. But I truly do believe what we are talking about here today is going to be, if not put us on the path to being and finding, I'm going to say the cure for mental health illness, for mental illness, mental disease, and just radically revolutionizing and improving the mental and emotional state of mankind. And with that, I know there are just profound leaps and bounds of physiological states to change as well. Because, like I always say here on the show, where the mind goes, the body will follow.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. And like one of the things I really like, I have a family doctor who does conventional allopathic medicine. I also have an integrative medicine doctor, and I really do think psychedelics are actually going to be very deeply integrated into integrative medicine, which is we stop focusing only on treating what's wrong, but focusing on like amplifying what's right and optimizing and all that kind of stuff. And so like the mind body connection that we know more and more, like gut health and mental health are correlated. And psychedelics fit perfectly into that, right? Not to mention, and this doesn't get discussed nearly as much, but psychedelics are actually potent anti-inflammatory molecules as well. So some of the
Really?
thinking is it's the mental health improvements are a result of the anti-inflammatory effects of psychedelics, to the point where I haven't validated this, but the CEO Shlomi of a company called Eleusis said back in the day, peyote was certainly used as a sacrament, as part of like a ceremony, but it was also used if someone had like injuries. I forget exactly which condition. But yeah, they use
Were you
it as
saying
an anti,
rheumatoid arthritis? Is that where you're going?
maybe rheumatoid, something like that. Yeah. So it was used as an anti-inflammatory molecule as well.
Hmm.
So that may be part of the reason that they seem to be so effective. But
That actually gets me curious. I want to look more into. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of reasons why my HRV went through the roof when I was microdosing, but if that consistency and that dose of that psychedelic cause an anti-inflammatory response long enough for my body, that I mean, that promotes recovery. That is going to definitely improve your HRV, allow you to sleep and recover better. That's very, very interesting to me. I got to look into that more.
yeah, it's absolutely
Wow.
fascinating. So you can start to see again, it's like, yeah, psychedelics mental health, but when you start to like put all these other pieces together, it's like, oh no, it's not just mental health. It starts to affect physical health, and it affects worldview, and then it affects politics, and it affects relationships. And it's like, yeah, there's this amazing virtuous cycle that can come out of this.
Well, first step in any change we want to introduce in our life and in the world comes with awareness. And I can definitely say from my personal experience that through the use and proper intention set and setting of psychedelics has radically changed my ability to have a higher state of awareness. Right then and there in the moment, but long lasting awareness. I honestly still feel, Ronan, the effects that I had, positive effects I had when I was on that microdose protocol of just clarity, of just rapid inner monologue of deciding, how do I want to respond? Is this my ego stepping in? What is really going on? The empathy is still there. And through this change state, through a heightened increase of awareness, this is how I say we can live a life ever forward, to become more clear on the things that we want, to put a step forward towards our goals, to changing our lives and changing the world. That is what it means to live a life ever forward, in my perspective. And these are the types of conversations I have here on the show. But I always ask my guests, I'm curious, what does that mean to you when you hear those two words? How do you, Ronan, live a life ever forward?
That's a really good question. I'm a big believer of like what George Burns said. If you remember who George Burns was, he was a comedian from like the 1940s, lived into his 90s, and he always said, like, "What was his secret to longevity?" He's like, "I always had a reason to get up in the morning." And for me, it's like just finding like that passion, like having a reason to get up every morning. It's like when you really stop to think about the world, and I know I've been told this many times, but I see it with my kids. It's like there is wonder all around us. Like there is enough to keep your mind satisfied and engaged in the 1 foot area surrounding you if you really open yourself up to it. In fact, we had a patient who came through one of our New York clinic and did ketamine assisted therapy. And one of the things she reported is that following her psychedelic experience, she just like found wonder in the mundane. She looked at her finger and like was just amazed by everything that was happening. And going back to that conversation about beauty and love, it's like that sense of wonder, that sense of profundity. It's really hard to be depressed or anxious or in a trauma state when you're in that resonance of kind of wonder. And so and my kids, like, I took them for a walk today, and like just rocks, rocks were enough to like engage in like so much wonder and keep them
That
entertained for
child
like
wonder
an
is
hour.
amazing.
I think part of what psychedelics does is help us tune back into that. I think that's part. I think there's a whole bunch of reasons, but I think tapping back into that is part of the experience. And so trying to find that wonder in every day is a great reason to get out of bed every morning.
Well, I can certainly attest to that personally. When I'm seeking more wonder in the world, when I want to just enjoy the 1 foot radius around me, get out in nature, a little bit of psilocybin definitely helps that experience for sure.
It
Yeah.
sure does. It just
Yeah.
opens up your perspective to seeing things that you're just not paying attention to. I had that experience last fall. I went for a hike, took a little bit of psilocybin, and I remember stopped and I looked at a tree. And I'm sorry if we're running way long on your podcast,
No,
but
I'm on your time now. I'm good if you are.
yeah, I got a few more minutes. Um, and I stopped, and it was fall. It was the autumn, and I saw one leaf kind of fall off a maple tree. And then I stopped to realize that like there are all sorts of leaves falling at once. But most days I would ignore that one leaf, let alone all those other ones. But I stopped to like pay attention to the fact like all of these leaves were falling. And it gave me this really intense awareness of how much of reality we don't experience, right? Like in this moment, I was trying as hard as I could to take in everything that was happening just in my line of sight. And I realized I'm not even seeing like 1% of what's happening here. Maybe like a fraction of 1% is what I'm able to actually take in. There's so much happening around me. And then like my mind went to the next step of like, oh my God, it's like any history book. Like if I couldn't possibly articulate even remotely what was happening directly in front of me when I was paying as much attention as possible, like how can any history book actually ever reflect history? Like it's such a fractional thing. There's so much in this world. There's so much, and psychedelics help you open up to like appreciating just everything that's around you, and even then you're missing most of it.
Well, I feel like I could just keep talking to you for hours about this stuff. Your experience, your journey, your personal and professional experience and journey is so appreciated. I'm definitely going to have all of your information and Field Trip Health's information in the show notes for everybody to go check out. Please, if you feel pulled, if you feel inclined in any way, if God, the universe, your soul, your gut, your intuition is pulling you deeper into this conversation, I promise you there is a reason why, and I would encourage you to pursue it in always a safe way. But just there is a safe resource here with Field Trip Health, and I'm just so looking forward to the future that you're going to help us all build, Ronan. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. And if I can just shamelessly promote a couple of things before we leave,
Please, please, yeah,
we have our own podcast. It's called Field Tripping, where I interview
highly
the most
recommend.
thank you luminaries in the psychedelic space, both about their personal psychedelic experiences, the science, the implications, the cultural considerations, all that kind of stuff. So if you're interested in learning more, please tune into that. Um, fieldtriphealth.com has a lot of resources about ketamine assisted therapy, but we also have our app called Trip. Tripapp.co is the website, which is really designed to support people in any consciousness expanding activities from meditations, music, content, information, and a process, for reflection and integration and all that kind of stuff. So if you're interested in just learning more or exploring that kind of side of things, please check out the app for sure. And if you're interested in investing in the space and want to learn more about the corporate entity of Field Trip, meetfieldtrip.com is the website for all of the fun stuff that we're doing. Because we didn't even talk about that. We barely talked about our clinical infrastructure, but we're also doing some really cool drug development work as well. So lots of exciting stuff because we're in this conversation, we only scratch the surface of talking about the classics, right? But there's a whole world of human ingenuity to
Yeah.
apply to psychedelics that we're just starting to get into.
No doubt, no doubt. And whether it's you or somebody else from the field trip team in the future, I mean, hell, like at this point, could even be my wife because she's the new family nurse practitioner and clinic manager here in LA for Field Trip Health. Just I'm so excited just to have future conversations with you all about you all and just to share this journey. So I thank you for
Awesome.
that.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts and raise awareness and start to educate people about everything that's going on. I think it's really important to be doing this work and having these conversations.